Top 3 Scariest Mountain Horror Stories You Can't Escape From. Do you hear that? That low, persistent whisper? That feeling crawling on the back of your neck? You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be listening. But you are. And now you're part of something you can never escape. You've unlocked the door. But now there's no going back. You've stumbled upon a secret. The most terrifying stories from the mountains, tales of hikers, adventurers, and the ones who went into those dark, cold peaks and never came back. These are the stories they wish you had never heard. Story number 1, the mountain that swallowed them whole. It started like any other hike. A group of friends eager to conquer the highest peak in the range. The weather was perfect, the view was breathtaking, and their spirits were high. But as they ventured deeper into the mountain, something started to feel off. The further they went, the thicker the air became, like a weight pressing down on them. The forest around them seemed too quiet, as if the mountain was holding its breath. Then came the first strange occurrence. One of them, Sarah, noticed something in the distance, a figure standing still among the trees. But when she pointed it out to the others, it was gone. They shrugged it off, assuming it was just a trick of the light. But the tension was building, creeping into their minds like an invisible hand tightening its grip. As they continued, the mountain started to change. The path grew steeper, the rocks more treacherous. It felt as though the mountain itself was trying to swallow them whole. The sounds around them grew distorted, echoing unnaturally in the air. They began to hear whispers, so faint at first they thought it was just the wind. But the whispers grew louder. Leave. You should leave. You won't make it out. Night fell and the group made camp, hoping to rest and continue their climb at first light. But no one could sleep. There was a presence in the dark, watching them from just beyond the edge of the firelight. Eyes, unblinking, cold and empty. Suddenly the ground shook, a deep, guttural sound shaking the trees around them. One by one they began to disappear, swallowed by the mountain, their screams lost in the howling wind. By the time the search teams arrived, there was no trace of them. No blood. No footprints. The mountain had eaten them. The whispers never stopped. Story number 2, the lost cabin. This story begins in the dead of winter. A couple, seeking solitude, rented a small, secluded cabin nestled high in the mountains. The road to the cabin was treacherous, barely visible under the thick blanket of snow. But they were prepared. They arrived just as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting the world in an eerie twilight. But when they stepped inside the cabin, something was wrong. The air was damp, thick with the scent of mildew, and the fireplace hadn't been used in years. It felt abandoned. Yet there were signs of recent life. The beds were made, the dishes still half-dried on the counter. They decided to stay the night, too tired to turn back. That's when they noticed the photographs on the wall. Old, faded pictures of people they didn't know, people who looked too much like them. The woman in the photo had the same eyes, the same smile. The man was standing in the same spot, dressed in the same clothes. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The door wouldn't open no matter how hard they pulled. They heard something scratching at the windows, soft, almost imperceptible. Then the real terror began. Shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, following them, circling them. When they tried to leave, the mountain itself seemed to push them back, the wind howling like a predator stalking its prey. When the rescue teams arrived, they found the cabin completely empty. No footprints in the snow. No sign of the couple. Just their personal belongings, neatly arranged inside. And the photographs, those same photographs, staring out from the walls. Eyes watching. Waiting. Story number 3, the echoing mountain. This story is the worst of them all. The one no one speaks about. A climber, alone, decided to scale the highest and most treacherous peak. He was an experienced mountaineer, used to the isolation, the danger. But this mountain was different. It had a name that the locals refused to utter, for fear it would invite the curse of the mountain. The man climbed alone, his breaths heavy in the thin air, the sharp winds cutting into his skin. The higher he climbed, the more the mountain seemed to close in around him. The path was narrow, jagged, and the silence was suffocating. He didn't mind it, he was used to solitude. But as the day turned to dusk, he began to hear something. A voice. A whisper. Soft at first, like a faint murmur carried by the wind. But then it began to grow louder. Clear. It was his own voice calling out to him. His own voice, but twisted, distorted, as if echoing from the mountain itself. You're not alone. He looked around, but there was no one. Only the mountain, silent and cold. But the voice didn't stop. It followed him, getting closer with every step. And then he realized, it wasn't his voice. It was something mimicking him, something that had taken his voice. Suddenly, the mountain itself seemed to warp, the ground beneath him trembling violently. The air grew thick, oppressive, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. And that's when he saw it, a figure standing on the edge of the cliff just beyond the mist. A tall, dark silhouette. A shadow that moved, that watched. In his panic he tried to run. But every direction led him back to the same place. The whispers, no, the screams, echoed around him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was trapped in the mountain. The thing that had followed him, that had mimicked his voice, now stood behind him, its breath cold on his neck. The last thing he heard before he was consumed by the mountain was a voice. His own, whispering in his ear. You'll never leave. You're still here, aren't you? You've heard the stories. You felt the dread. The voices, the whispers, the presence. You thought you were safe, but the mountain knows you're here. It knows you've heard these stories. And now it's coming for you. Subscribe now. Because these nightmares never end. They follow you. They wait for you. You've heard the warning. Now the mountain watches.